All right.
Hello.
So I'm, like you said, Jonas. I'm a JavaScript developer at ETCDEV.
Zachary Belford, same thing. We work on the Emerald platform. So who's this talk for? This talk's for developers who want to build distributed and decentralized systems and applications on them. What are we going to cover today? We're going to go over why bother build a decentralized application. How do you start? What are some of the common challenges? And how Emerald platform will help you overcome those challenges. So why do you want to build a decentralized application? There's many reasons. The first of which that we like is that it's unstoppable, right? And so what unstoppable means is that it runs indefinitely, and no server will just shut down and cease to exist. So like, for example, in gaming, there's a lot of video games that the servers just get shut down and everybody can't play the game anymore. Say like Warhammer, like Star Wars Galaxy. But there's also a lot of examples of businesses that basically get shut down because, say, a particular company deprecates an API or something like that, and it makes it so you can't do much. Another reason why might be like banking the unbanked. So roughly 2 billion people don't have access to banking, whether it be due to lack of government identification, or they just don't have enough money to deposit to actually create a bank account, or maybe giving access to certain financial instruments to people that otherwise wouldn't have access to those, whether it be through like decentralized exchanges or different investment funds. And more interestingly, the idea of like companies getting blacklisted by banks, where like the bank just decides they don't like the type of business you're doing, and so they say, no more for you. Like for example, I don't know, like WikiLeaks and Visa, is a good example of that. Another reason might be censorship resistance. So you don't want to specify their application can only be used by a particular demographic, right? Like, it shouldn't matter maybe what age you are, race, economic standpoint, where in the world you're from. You should be able to use these applications. And further, you should also be able to innovate freely. The idea of like, you don't have to ask permission to innovate, which I think is really important. And lastly, we have this concept of serverless, which is super big, hot topic these days, especially with the likes of Google Cloud Engine and AWS. They have this notion of serverless infrastructure where you essentially build the logic and the front end of your application and don't have to worry about scaling and data availability and uptime and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of benefits to building decentralized applications. But there's also many, many challenges. I'm sure many of you guys would know. First of which being, how do I even get started with any of this stuff? So most people would go into their favorite search engine or whatever and Google, how do I build a DApp? And there's a ton of information out there that comes up. And the issue that I've found getting into this stuff was that it's hard to make sense of like how to piece all this information together, especially if you're like, yeah, I want to use Ethereum Classic. So you start like, how do I build a DApp on ETC? And there's not really a whole lot there. Little did I know back then, it doesn't really matter what chain it's on. But anyway, it can be really painful, and most of the time, a lot of people will end up just giving up at some point just because the challenges are too great. Yeah, like an example of such challenges is like when you're starting out, like, what does this look like for my users, right? Like, do they need to run a node? And there's a lot of trade-offs in there, right? Like trade-offs between friction for the user versus security and better, more decentralized network. They could be sending just signed transaction to something like Gas Tracker or any sort of RPC provider. But again, like, yeah, it's a little less secure, right? And less decentralized. So these are some trade-offs, right, that you're expected to make on your own as an app developer coming into this stuff. Another example of which is being like, do I as a developer need to run a node? And like, you can get by without running a node, but you're gonna have a bad time basically. Like in development, you're probably gonna want a test network of some type, but test networks are quite finicky. Like for example, like Morden is one of Ethereum Classic's test nets, and if any of you have used it, you'd know that it has like a ton of forks. So it's very hard to reach actual consensus on what's going to happen, and that leads you to build your app for all these random edge cases that are never really going to exist on mainnet. Hopefully not, anyway. Yeah, and there's some other examples, like a lot of the documentation will point you to running your own private network, which is really great to do, but it's not very practical for the person who's just looking for that quick start. Another one would be, say, Go Ethereum Geth has a --dev option to the command line, which gives you a bunch of Genesis accounts and gives you all the private keys and stuff. Or sorry, no, it doesn't do that. It actually makes, like, it's a bit tedious because it forces you to basically turn on the miner and then mine some Ethereum to an account, and then you have to send that Ethereum around so that you can then test with it, right? So let's say you take one of these options, you get it up and running, and then you're like, okay, well, how do I know that it's working? I want to explore the blocks, or like see what's going on there, right? So you start poking around at the JSON RPC, or you use Geth console, and neither of those are really a good experience because, yeah, it's tricky to know which commands you need to intertwine together, and yeah, that sort of thing. So, so the idea is to get a block explorer, right? But the issue with a lot of the block explorers is that they typically have a lot of dependencies to install, and they pretty much all require a database. So again, you've just like increased the amount of friction for the new developer coming into this, trying to get going. So let's say you download some Explorer or whatever, you get that running. So now you have your node, you have your Ethereum, or you have your Explorer going. So you're ready to start building your application. So it's time to get into smart contracts, I guess. And so when you get there, there's a whole bunch of different programming languages on top of it for you to choose from. And it's pretty unclear at first which one's the best there. So maybe, you pick the most popular one or the one that has the most tools or whatever. But again, more research to do. And so you say, OK, I'm going to use Solidity. And now when you get into using the Solidity and you want to actually deploy your code, to deploy your code, you're going to have to compile a Solidity, construct a transaction for it, sign the transaction for it, and then send it, like broadcast it to the network. Which is, fairly tedious, but there's a lot of tools out there, like say Remix, that'll help you do this. But you'll find that you can't build your whole application inside of Remix. Like, it's not very sustainable. So like, you can't write automated tests in there. To my knowledge, anyway. And it doesn't handle any sort of life cycle to it. Like, you have to deploy the contract, grab the address, paste it into your app. It's not very cohesive with that. And generally speaking, I find it best to use as more of like a code pen sort of thing, or like JS Fiddle type of tool. And if you wanted to deploy to mainnet, typically you'll have to have an account inside of Geth, and you'll have to unlock the account, which kind of opens it up to the world. It's a little bit scary. So let's say you get to the point where you have your smart contract, and you want to get data from the chain inside your application. There's a number of ways to do that, one of which being raw JSON RFC commands, which, as I mentioned, it's pretty hard to understand which calls you need to make to accomplish the particular goal that you're trying to achieve. And typically it requires a fairly in-depth understanding of the inner working, like not inner workings, but like how Ethereum works. Like again, you're a new developer trying to get into this stuff, it's just more barriers, right? So you look at stuff like Web3, right? And Web3 is great, but it has one bigger challenge to me anyway, that's like it uses the GPL license, which is what's called contagious, meaning that if I use a GPL licensed project in my project, then my project must also be GPL. And the idea there being like, okay, open source everything. But that doesn't really work when you're like a company who wants to build commercial software. You just have to like put a GPL on it and open source it and then hope to God nobody ever finds it. Yeah, so let's say, you know, you go Web3 route or just writing raw JSON RPC commands. Either way, you're ending up at a point where you're reading and writing to the chain or smart contract. And then you get to the point where, okay, I'm going to build some UI for the application, which is another sort of can of worms, right? There's a lot of common patterns for building UI. And there is not that many reusable components, especially relating to blockchain stuff. Like, everybody's writing the same code for like sending a transaction, or like building a form to send a transaction, or like view a transaction's details, or listing out networks that are available and what block number they're on, or like switching from different accounts and stuff like that. And basically, like, yeah, front-end development is really difficult. It's not easy, right? It's its own whole thing to learn. And if you want to do it well and you want to maintain this look and feel of your application and your business, you're going to have to do a lot of forethought and have a lot of experience with this sort of stuff. There's also a lot of front-end frameworks for you to choose from, right? So you're going to have to then go find a front-end framework to use, and if you don't really know what you're doing, then it's going to be really hard to pick one that's actually suitable for you. So most applications need to send transactions, and that requires you to build a lot of UI. But there's sort of like, and to me anyways, the bigger concern is like the control over wallets. So I believe, and I hope you guys too, that users should own their private keys. Like if you don't own the private key, you don't own the Ethereum, right? And further, I don't think that app developers should be able to arbitrarily send transactions on a user's behalf, or save their password so they can make transactions on their behalf. Like the example before where you're using Remix to deploy your contract, and you have to go into Geth and unlock your account so that it'll just like work or whatever. Well, in that period that your Geth account's unlocked, like they can go to town, right? And yeah, it's a bit scary, right? Like generally speaking, nobody should have access to your private keys in any sort of way, but it should hopefully be also a semi-frictionless experience to use your application. And also, users shouldn't really have to make a new wallet or account for each application if they don't want to, right? Like, you know, you want to use this application, it's like, oh, I got to install MetaMask and then send some Ethereum to it or whatever, and oh, I only have Ethereum here, so it's just, it can be quite problematic, right? Anyway, yeah, so those are some of the problems that we wanted to solve with the Emerald platform. And for each of those problems, I'm going to hand it over to Shane, and he's going to go over how Emerald platform may help you.
Cool. So, how we help you with like wallet control is we use Emerald Wallet. So we treat the wallet as like a central mechanism and user interface through which you sign and send all of the transactions. So it manages all of the accounts, but actually we're using our own tool underneath, under the hood, to manage all these transactions. And that is called Emerald Vault. And what that does is give you a JSON RPC API and a storage mechanism to keep your keys and your password safe. And it can be, like I said, it can be run as a JSON RPC server, and it also works offline. So we had lots of problems with the exploring blocks earlier. So the way we solved that is giving you an Emerald Explorer, which doesn't require any database syncing, lets you view all the blocks, all the transactions, all the addresses. And Geth also provides you an RPC method to get all of an address transaction, so you don't have to walk the chain or do any crazy stuff for that. So building the wallet and the Explorer were also a great opportunity to dog food our own tools. And both of those apps were built using EmeraldJS and EmeraldJS UI. So what is EmeraldJS? It's a high-level API on top of the Ethereum JSON RPC and the Emerald Vault RPC I talked about earlier. And it also fills a bunch of gaps, like providing bulk API and like the additional command I was talking about before, which is get address transactions. It lets you work across different chains, and also provides utilities like doing way math and getting different chain IDs and all kinds of stuff. And then what about like building the applications UI? So to build the applications UI, we built a framework for that, which is like fully themable, which has a great, beautiful default that you can customize any way you want. It's like super reusable. And it's very opinionated to get you like super far and to give you all the front-end practices to keep you on the right track. So in the first example here, we're using what we're calling like presentational components or dumb components inside of React. And they only display data, they don't fetch anything. And we also have, like this one is a very high level one for block number, but we have lower level ones like lists, buttons, inputs, that kind of thing. But the higher level ones are interesting because you get a lot in a very small amount of time. So like I said, the first one here is a high-level one, whereas the second example is the other set of components we have, which is fetching components. So you can use them both together here to fetch stuff from the blockchain. Then you get the block number back here in a React render prop, and then fire it off to the dumb presentational component. So how does this all come together? It comes together under the project that is the Emerald CLI, and it's just an overarching tool that helps you with any Ethereum development and lets you create, well, I'll go through each one. So Emerald New will create a new project from a template that we're calling Emerald Starter Kit. And what is Emerald Starter Kit? Well, you know, as Zach always says, a good to-do app is about like 30 lines of code away from being just about anything. And that was like a big motivation for doing this starter kit. So it's just a to-do app, but it's really just a very opinionated template for building a DApp.
I'm also not very popular, as you can.
Like 3 likes, 1 retweet. So before showing you, say, like the developer flow, I'll just walk through the starter kit as if it would be just deployed and what the user would see. So you can see here, it's just a to-do app, and you can see the app bar by default helps you out with, like, you know, what block you're on, if you need to switch networks or whatever, how much money you have. There's also like an account switcher on the top for multiple accounts. And what it gives you, the starter kit gives you this to-do list that Yeah, so it gives you a to-do list, and so what you would do is, okay, type something in there, you hit send transaction, and then what that does is pop open Emerald Wallet, which lets you review and lets you review all of the data and the stuff that you put in before you sign and send the transaction. And then once you sign it, you'll get the transaction details page on whether it succeeded or not. And then if you went back to the to-do list, you'd see that it was created. And then, say if you tried to mark it done or delete it or whatever, it would go through the same flow where you got to sign and send. So that's what it looks like for the user. But what would a developer have to do to even get that running and started? So first thing you'd want to do is run a test RPC. So Emerald test RPC uses Sputnik VM dev underneath, which gives you a bunch of default accounts and the test RPC and gets you started really quick with that. And then the next part you would have to do is deploy it onto that network. And so you'd hit Emerald deploy, and it would deploy all the contracts in the contracts folder of the Emerald starter kit. And yeah, so we also provide some other commands that'll just boot the wallet and say block explorer. And yeah, so that's a very, very high level summary of what Emerald platform is going to do for developers.
Yeah, and the intention there behind the CLI is sort of we want to move towards this idea of having that Rails-like development experience for DApps, right? But more so, the grand goal here is to build unstoppable applications that are of incredibly high quality and that have really nice user interfaces. And we want to do it on top of Ethereum Classic. And we want to make sure that they support the fundamental principles of Ethereum Classic. Yeah, so we're doing a workshop tomorrow. I believe it's at 1, where we will be going into this stuff more in depth for developers. If you'd like to attend, we could get started building your own application in that workshop. Please join our community on Gitter if you have any questions about this stuff. And yeah, help us build the future of ETCDEV.
GitHub.
Yeah.
Emerald and all the stuff we talked about today is on the GitHub. And yeah, thanks.
That's it.
That's all I got.